A few weeks ago, I set myself a rule that sounded simple on paper and turned out to be a lot harder to actually live by. For 7 full days, every single thing I used, ate, cleaned with, or bought had to come from one place, Dollar Tree. Nothing else. No grocery store backup, no quick run to Target when something ran out, no ordering anything online, just whatever this one store could provide for an entire week of normal life. I wanted to know 2 things going into this. First, could I actually survive a full week this way without feeling like I was missing something essential? And second, when I added up every single receipt at the end, would the total number be smaller than I expected, or would it quietly creep up into something that wasn't really a bargain at all once you accounted for how much extra stuff I ended up buying just because it was cheap? Stick with me through all 7 days, because the final total genuinely surprised me, and it wasn't in the direction I expected going in. Before I get into the day-by-day breakdown, I want to be clear about the rules I set for myself, because I think the details actually matter here. Every meal, every snack, every toiletry, every cleaning product had to come from this one store. No exceptions, no cheating with something already in my pantry from before the challenge started. I kept every single receipt in a folder on my kitchen counter, and I promised myself I wouldn't do any mental math or estimating along the way. I wanted the final number to be a genuine surprise to me too, not something I was quietly tracking and adjusting my spending around as the week went on. That distinction turned out to matter more than I expected, because it meant I was making real decisions each day based on what I actually needed, not what would look good on a final tally. Day 1 started with the big shopping trip, the one meant to set up the rest of the week. I walked in with a rough mental list: breakfast items, something for lunch, something for dinner, basic toiletries, and cleaning supplies for the apartment. The cereal aisle was the first real decision point. A box of a lesser-known cereal brand ran $1.25, noticeably smaller than a standard grocery store box, so I grabbed 2 instead of 1, already quietly adjusting my assumption that a dollar item automatically replaces a full-size product somewhere else. Milk isn't sold here, so I picked up a few of the shelf-stable milk cartons instead, 3 of them for $3.75 total. For lunch and dinner staples, I grabbed pasta, a jar of sauce, canned vegetables, and a bag of rice, all in the $1 to $1.50 range. Toiletries were next: toothpaste, a toothbrush, bar soap, and shampoo, all under $2 combined somehow. By the time I got to the register for this first big trip, the receipt read $28.40 for what I estimated was roughly 4 to 5 days worth of basic groceries and supplies. That number felt genuinely good walking out of the store, better than I expected for a full cart of items. I remember standing in the parking lot afterward actually recalculating in my head, because I'd gone in half expecting to spend closer to $40 just to cover the basics, and coming in well under that on the very first trip set a tone for the week that I honestly wasn't sure would hold up once the smaller package sizes started catching up with me. Loading everything into my kitchen afterwards, the sheer volume of items was noticeably higher than a comparable grocery haul. More individual boxes and containers taking up counter space than I was used to, even though the total weight and quantity of actual food was probably a bit less once you accounted for the smaller portions on almost everything. Day 1 evening was the first real test of whether this food was actually going to work as regular meals, not just a stunt. Dinner was the pasta with the jarred sauce, and honestly, it tasted completely normal, maybe slightly thinner in texture than a name brand sauce I'd normally buy, but nothing that stood out as noticeably worse. Breakfast the next morning was the cereal with the shelf-stable milk, and this is where the day on budget started to feel a little more fragile than the receipt suggested. The cereal box, being smaller than I was used to, meant I'd already gone through nearly half of it in 2 servings, which quietly told me this box wasn't going to stretch across the full week the way I'd assumed when I only bought 2. Day 2, I hit my first real obstacle. I wanted coffee in the morning, and realized the instant coffee packets I'd grabbed on day 1 were far weaker than I expected, more like flavored hot water than an actual cup of coffee. I actually tried making it 3 separate times that morning, first following the exact instructions on the packet, then adding a second packet, before finally settling on using nearly double the recommended amount just to get something resembling the coffee strength I was used to at home. I used nearly double the recommended packets just to get something resembling normal coffee strength, which meant a box I thought would last the week was going to run out by day 4 at this rate. This is the first moment the challenge revealed something important. The price tag tells you what you're paying, but it doesn't tell you how much of the product you'll actually need to get a normal result. And that gap matters more than people usually think about walking into a store like this. I actually went back and reread the packet instructions after this happened, wondering if I'd simply misunderstood the serving size, but no, it genuinely was formulated lighter than what I was used to, which meant the real cost per cup of coffee I was drinking was quietly double what the shelf price implied, even though nothing about the transaction itself had changed. Lunch on day 2 was canned soup, which performed exactly as expected: simple, filling, no real surprises, and genuinely a fair value at the price. I paired it with a slice of the bread I'd grabbed on day 1, and the combination felt close enough to a normal lunch that I didn't find myself thinking about the challenge at all while eating it, which felt like a small but meaningful win. By the end of day 2, I hadn't spent any additional money, still running on the day 1 haul, but I mentally flagged the coffee and cereal as items I'd likely need to restock sooner than planned. Day 3 brought the first unplanned purchase. I ran out of dish soap faster than expected, since the bottle was noticeably smaller than a standard size, more travel size than full size really. I hadn't even thought to check the bottle size carefully during the original shopping trip, since dish soap is one of those items you assume is roughly the same across every store without really comparing volumes side by side, and this was the first small reminder that assumption doesn't always hold up here. A quick trip added another $1.25 to the running total, bringing me to $29.65 through 3 days. Dinner this night was rice with canned vegetables and a small can of chicken, and this meal genuinely impressed me. Filling, reasonably balanced, and cheap enough that I did quick math in my head, realizing this single meal cost under $3 total for the portion I made. This was the first point in the week where I felt like the challenge was actually working in my favorite, rather than just being a stunt I was pushing through. I remember sitting down with that bowl of rice and vegetables, thinking that if every meal for the rest of the week looked something like this, both in taste and in cost, the whole experiment would end up being a pretty easy recommendation for anyone looking to genuinely cut their weekly food spending without feeling deprived. Of course, I already had a quiet suspicion that not every meal would hit this same mark, but for one evening at least, it felt like proof that this could work. Day 4 is where things got noticeably more complicated. I ran out of the shelf-stable milk faster than expected, since I'd been using it for both cereal and coffee, and a return trip added 3 more cartons for another $3.75. The cereal box was also nearly empty by this point, a full 2 days ahead of my original estimate, so I grabbed 2 more boxes for another $2.50. Running total by the end of day 4 sat at $38.90, still reasonable for 4 days of food and supplies for one person, but climbing faster than the initial receipt had suggested it might. Standing at the register for this second unplanned trip, I noticed I was already developing a slightly different shopping instinct than I'd had on day 1, actually picking up an extra unit of things just in case, rather than buying the exact amount I thought I'd need, which is a subtle but real shift in behavior that smaller package sizes seem to encourage over time, and one that could easily erode some of the savings if I wasn't paying close attention to it. Dinner on day 4 was a genuine low point, a frozen meal that promised something close to a full dinner but delivered a portion size that left me legitimately hungry an hour later, forcing me to supplement with a bag of pretzels just to feel satisfied. This was the first moment I actually felt the trade-off of this challenge in a physical, uncomfortable way, rather than just as a budgeting curiosity. Sitting there still hungry after finishing what was supposed to be a full dinner, I found myself genuinely annoyed in a way that no amount of money saved could fully offset in that specific moment. And it made me realize that a food challenge like this isn't purely a math problem. There's a real, lived experience underneath the numbers that a spreadsheet would never capture. I made a mental note right then to be more careful reading the actual weight and serving suggestions on frozen meals going forward, rather than assuming the picture on the box represents a realistic portion for one adult. Day 5 brought a genuinely pleasant surprise after the rough patch the day before. I tried a different frozen meal option, a pasta based on this time, and it was noticeably more filling and satisfying than the one from the previous night, proving that within the same freezer section, quality and portion size varied more than I expected from shelf to shelf. This taught me something worth remembering. Inconsistency inside a single category is common here. So if one specific product disappoints you, it doesn't necessarily mean the whole category is a bad value. It might just mean you happen to grab the weaker option out of several choices sitting right next to each other. No additional spending happened on day 5, keeping the running total steady at $38.90 through 5 full days. I actually spent a few minutes that evening comparing the 2 frozen meal boxes side by side in my recycling bin, trying to figure out what specifically made one so much better than the other, and the honest answer seemed to come down to sauce ratio more than anything. The better one simply included noticeably more sauce relative to the pasta, which made the whole dish feel far more substantial and satisfying by the time I finished it. By the halfway point of this challenge, a clear pattern had started to emerge that I hadn't fully expected going in. The meals I cooked from scratch using basic staples, the rice and vegetables, the pasta and sauce, consistently outperformed the pre-made convenience options, the frozen meals and instant coffee, both in taste and in how far the money actually stretched. It made sense once I thought about it. Convenience items tend to carry a bigger markup relative to their actual ingredient cost everywhere, not just here, but seeing that pattern play out so clearly within a single week, using nothing but products from one store, made the lesson land in a way it hadn't quite before. Day 6 is when the household supplies side of this challenge started to matter more than the food side. I needed more toilet paper, and the small package size here meant what I bought on day 1 was already running low, adding another $1.50 to the total. I also grabbed a couple of cleaning wipes containers since I'd been using them continuously on kitchen counters throughout the week, another $2 added. Running total climbed to $42.40 through 6 days. Looking back at the week's pattern of unplanned trips by this point, it was becoming clear that household supplies, rather than food itself, were the real driver of extra spending, since every single unplanned purchase so far had been a refill of something non-food: dish soap, milk, toilet paper, cleaning wipes, while the actual meals I'd planned for had mostly stretched exactly as far as I'd expected them to. Dinner this night was a return to the pasta and jarred sauce combination from day 1, which by this point felt less like a meal and more like a reliable fallback I could count on whenever I hadn't planned something more specific. And honestly, there's real value in having at least one dependent, inexpensive meal option you can lean on repeatedly without it feeling like a punishment. Standing in my kitchen making it for the second time that week, I noticed I'd already developed a small routine around it. Exactly how long to let the sauce simmer, exactly how much to season it to make it feel a little different from the first time I'd made it, and that small bit of personal adaptation made repeating a cheap meal feel less like settling and more like actually cooking, which surprised me more than I expected it to by day 6. Day 7, the final day, and the one I'd been building toward the whole week in terms of actually tallying everything up honestly. I made one last small trip in the morning, mostly to grab enough breakfast and lunch items to comfortably finish out the day without running shorts, adding another $4.20 to the total. Walking through the store on this final trip felt noticeably different from day 1. I moved through the aisles with a lot more confidence about which specific products had actually held up well over the week, and which ones I'd quietly decided not to repurchase if I never did this again. A kind of practical knowledge that simply wasn't there on that very first shopping trip when everything was still an unknown. Dinner on the final night was intentionally a bit more ambitious than the rest of the week. A stir-fry using the canned vegetables, rice, and a can of chicken, seasoned with a small bottle of soy sauce I'd picked up earlier in the week, specifically for a moment like this. It turned out better than I expected, genuinely tasting like a real homemade dinner rather than a budget compromised, which felt like a fitting way to close out 7 days of eating almost entirely from a single dollar store. Eating that final dinner, I actually felt a strange sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with the money at all, just the simple satisfaction of having planned, prepped, and pulled off a genuinely decent homemade meal using ingredients that individually cost next to nothing, and that feeling stuck with me even more than the running total sitting in my notes app at that point. So here's the full 7-day total, added up honestly from every single receipt across the week, including every unplanned restock trip along the way. The final number came to $46.60 for one person's food, toiletries, and basic cleaning supplies across a full 7 days. I'll admit, tallying up all 6 receipts on my kitchen table that final evening felt oddly ceremonial after a week of deliberately not doing this math along the way. laying them all out side by side, and adding each one by hand, rather than just trusting a mental estimate I might have gotten wrong somewhere in the middle of the week. To put that in perspective, I looked back at my typical weekly grocery spending from a normal supermarket trip over the past month, and my average usually lands somewhere between $70 and $90 for a comparable week of meals and supplies for one person. That means this challenge, even accounting for every single extra trip caused by smaller package sizes and products running out faster than expected, still came in noticeably below my normal spending, roughly 40 to 50% less for the week overall. When I actually sat with that percentage for a minute, it started to feel almost too good, which is exactly why I wanted to look more closely at what was actually behind that number rather than just celebrating it at face value. But I want to be honest about what that number does and doesn't actually capture, because a raw dollar total, by itself, can be a little misleading if you don't look at what's behind it. The smaller package sizes meant more trips and slightly more mental effort tracking what I had left, which is a real cost, even if it doesn't show up on a receipt. Over the course of the week, I ended up making 4 separate trips instead of the single big haul I'd originally planned for, and while none of those extra trips took very long individually, that's still real time out of my week that a single large grocery trip wouldn't have required. The frozen meal portion sizes were inconsistent, meaning some nights felt completely satisfying and one night left me genuinely hungry enough to need a backup snack. And the coffee and cereal both ran out faster than a typical grocery store version would have, meaning the per-use cost on those 2 specific items was higher than the shelf price alone suggested, something that only becomes obvious once you actually track usage day by day rather than judging a product purely by what it costs sitting on the shelf. None of that erases the overall savings, but it does mean the real story here isn't simply cheaper equals better across the board. It's that the savings are real and significant, as long as you go in expecting to make more frequent smaller trips rather than one big weekly haul the way you might at a regular grocery store. Personally, this challenge changed how I think about using this store for everyday essentials rather than just occasional deal hunting. I don't think I'd want to do this every single week, purely from a variety perspective. The meal options do start to feel repetitive by day 5 or 6 if you're not getting creative with combinations. But as a genuine cost-saving strategy for weeks where money is tight, or as a supplement to a normal grocery routine rather than a full replacement, this held up far better than I expected walking in. If you're considering trying something like this yourself, my honest advice is to budget for smaller, more frequent trips rather than assuming one big haul will carry you the full week, and to specifically stock up on 2 or 3 reliable fallback meals early on, since having something dependent to lean on made the harder days of this challenge feel a lot more manageable than they otherwise would have. I'd also suggest keeping a small buffer in your budget beyond whatever your first trip totals, simply because smaller package sizes almost guarantee at least 1 or 2 unplanned restocks before the week is out. And building that expectation in from the start will save you from feeling like you've somehow failed the challenge the moment you need to go back for more milk or more coffee. $46.60 for a full week for one person, covering food, toiletries, and cleaning supplies combined, is a number that genuinely stuck with me long after this challenge ended, and it's changed at least a few of my regular shopping habits going forward, even outside of a strict 7-day experiment like this one. I've started picking up a handful of the pantry staples, the rice, the canned vegetables, the pasta and sauce combination, on my regular grocery trips now too, simply because nothing about this week convinced me those specific items were worse in any meaningful way than what I'd normally pay 2 or 3 times more for elsewhere. The bigger lesson, more than any single dollar figure, is that treating a store like this as a complete replacement for one specific week, rather than just an occasional stop for a few deals here and there, revealed value in categories I genuinely wasn't expecting going in, and that's worth more to me than the exact number on the final receipt.